So around the age of 15, I started praying consistently. For context, Muslims pray either 3 or 5 times a day. If you're Sunni, you pray 5 times a day. If you're Shia, you combine two of those prayers and you pray 3 times a day. So Persian people tend to be Shia, and so was my family. And around age 15, I started praying consistently. And my mom taught me that I can't pray on my period. And I loved that. I loved that because I didn't like praying. I really did not like praying. I only did it because I thought it would amplify the amount of good deeds that I'm doing and it would make me a better person. I did it out of fear, not because I wanted to. And not because anyone was forcing me either, to be clear. But I loved my period week because that meant I didn't have to pray. What I didn't realize was the reason why I couldn't pray. Initially, I thought it was for the purposes of rest and rejuvenation, especially because on your period, you can be in a lot of pain, you can be really tired, your energy levels might be low. So I thought it's a little, sit back, relax for a week. Then I found out that women can't pray on their period because it cancels out their wudu. Well, that's the Arabic way of saying it. In Farsi, we say wuzu. Wuzu is a cleansing ritual that's done before prayer, where you clean your face, your arms, your feet, the crown of your head with water, and that spiritually cleanses you and allows you to engage in prayer. However, your wuzu will get canceled if you use the bathroom, if you expel any bodily fluids, if you ejaculate, and if you menstruate. So women can't pray on their periods because their wuzu isn't considered valid because they're bleeding. Now, for a 15-year-old, I didn't think too much of it because I was still in the mindset that, I have to pray and I have to do these things to be a good person and to avoid going to hell. So I didn't really question it too much. Not long after that, my mom taught me another purification ritual called ghusl. While wuzu is the minor purification ritual that's done routinely before prayer or before touching the Quran, for example, ghusl is the major purification ritual done after major spiritual impurities like ejaculation, sexual intercourse, childbirth, and menstruation. So after each period, I have to perform ghusl in the shower to purify and cleanse myself after menstruating and becoming spiritually dirty. And that's when the gears started to grind. Imagine a girl at the tail end of puberty who's still awkward and weird and ashamed of her body that's just gone through a big change, ashamed of her period, and still coming to terms with all these huge changes that she's experiencing. Imagine a girl going through all of that and then being told that she's dirty while she's on her period, that her period is a source of spiritual contamination, of spiritual impurity. This points to a larger picture, that religions took something that is uniquely feminine and gave men credit for it by creating a male deity. But the thing is, women are still the ones who menstruate and give birth, so the physical evidence is still there. We still got the receipts. So religions found a way to shame women for the physical evidence that they are still the creators. I competed at the provincial powerlifting championships on the heaviest day of my period a couple of months ago. I took 2 juicy Advils and lifted the heaviest weights that I've touched all year, and I placed second, all while being spiritually impure. Before we begin, I want to start with a poem that I wrote. It's called For Every Woman. For every girl who was robbed of her innocence. For every girl who was taught to be ashamed of her body. For every girl who was told it was her fault. For every girl who grew into a woman but never outgrew fear. For every woman who was given a life that wasn't hers. For every woman who was brushed off and told to find God. For every woman who was told she was unclean after she bled. For every woman who was told she was unclean after she birthed. For every woman who wept in silence. for every woman who dreamt of peace. I wish I could pray so I could create the time to fight for every woman. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. Today I've got a big episode for you all. This was honestly one of the hardest episodes I've ever written, and one of the episodes that took me the longest amount of time to write and research. I could easily say it took me at least 5 weeks to prepare this episode. So I'm really excited. I really want to get into this. But before we do, I want to introduce myself for anybody here who might be new. So my name is Nikki. I am your host. I am the baddest bitch in the building. Not to be confused with you, who is also the baddest bitch in the building. And I have a bachelor's with high distinction, put some respect on my motherfucking name, in public policy, and a master's in political science with a focus on political theory. And a lot of my research focused on how underdogs can build and institutionalize power from the bottom up. Some of my work was published. Some of my other work was invited to be presented at conferences in North America. And before producing this podcast, I used to work as a management consultant where I advised the executives of some of the biggest and most influential companies in Canada. And it was really working with them and sitting in boardrooms with these C-suite executives, like the CEOs, the CFOs, where I realized that power is not given. It is never given. It is either taken or it's created. So this podcast is about how to realize the power that is already within us, that we already have, by hacking the patriarchy and finding its loopholes and milking the system like a cow. Because unfortunately, I don't think the system is going to be dismantled in our lifetime. I think it's starting to happen, but I don't think it's going to be there by the end of our lives. And I'm a firm believer that instead of complaining about things that we can't necessarily change, we should learn how to take advantage of them and come out the winner in every single situation, even in systems that weren't meant for us to succeed. And that's the whole purpose of my podcast. Through my patriarchy hacks, I teach women how to unlearn the harmful conditioning that we've been taught and to find the patriarchy's loopholes that we can use to our advantage. And in my non-patriarchy hack episodes, I discuss various things that we can unlearn to dismantle patriarchy in our own lives, especially the internalized patriarchy that's in our heads and controlling a lot of our lives. And speaking of my patriarchy hacks, I recently released a book called How to Hack the Patriarchy, which is about my first 20 patriarchy hacks that will help you unlearn the traits that have been keeping you small, quiet, non-threatening, nice girls for your whole life. And it's going to help you find tangible ways of applying my 20 patriarchy hacks to your life so that you can get ahead in your work dynamics, especially if you work in a toxic workplace or a male-dominated workplace. This book is going to be a huge help to you. And in your relationships, if you feel like you're constantly overgiving, if you feel like you're unappreciated, if you feel like you should be getting more, but you're not, that's because there's a lot of conditioning that you need to unlearn before you can even realize that there are hacks and loopholes that you can utilize. So my book is available as a paperback, hardcover, Kindle, and EPUB file. So I will leave all those links in the show notes for you. And if you read the book already and you love it, make sure to give it a review on Amazon because that is how the algorithm finds other readers. And if you like this show, make sure that you are following or are subscribed and that you like, comment, rate the show so that the algorithm, again, knows how to find you so that you never miss an episode. By the way, I did announce the winner for my giveaway last week, but I did it just through DMs because the person didn't want to be tagged in my story publicly. So I wanted to respect her wishes. So thank you for everybody who entered, and thank you everybody who has purchased a copy of my book. Now, there's a big paradox happening in the world right now, which is that despite organized religions, and in this episode I'm going to talk about Abrahamic religions specifically, despite these religions being patriarchal, women actually tend to be more religious than men. One of the biggest research studies that was conducted was a 2016 study by the Pew Research Center, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., in the United States. which found that on average, women do tend to be more religious than men, especially in Christianity. So Christian women are more likely to attend weekly religious services, but in Islam and Judaism, it's the other way around because religious norms prioritize men's attendance to religious worship. And in many countries, women are more likely to pray and are more likely to consider religion a significant part of their lives. So it's safe to say that on average, women tend to be more religious than men in most countries. This gender gap has puzzled researchers for years, and no one has been able to find a definitive answer to it. Some say it's biology and genetics, but as we'll see with the research, because I'm going to talk about that, the scientific aspect is pretty gender neutral. It's like bisexual. Now, other researchers say that this gap is based on psychology, upbringing, social status, participation in the workforce, and a lack of what they call existential security, because women tend to face more violence and poverty than men do. While there's general agreement that it is in fact a variety of factors that play into this gap, none of them can provide a satisfactory answer to this question. And in the 5 weeks I spent writing and researching for this episode, I looked at that research and I could tell you, I was really frustrated reading a lot of these studies because to me, the answer seems obvious. And unfortunately, a lot of the researchers looking at these questions were men. And that could have contributed to the fact that they missed this nuance in the lived experience of most women. I put a prompt on my story a few weeks ago when I wanted to write this episode, when I wanted to start writing it. And I asked if any of you have experiences or religious trauma that you wanted to share. And I got so many responses from you. I got so many responses, and so many of them were similar because a lot of you have experienced either religious trauma or some kind of adverse experience with religion. And listen, if building a community of tens of thousands of women and talking to hundreds of you over the course of the last year has taught me anything, it's that no one has ever had an original experience in their life. So if a few women are saying this, then I'm sure thousands or even millions of them have experienced it. So baddies, I may have found the missing piece that a lot of this research has overlooked and can't explain. So we're going to get into that. In this episode, like I said, we're going to answer 2 questions. Number 1, if Abrahamic religions are so patriarchal, why do so many women follow them? And number 2, can organized religion be a tool that serves women? But first, we need to understand how religion hurts women and hurts their sense of self. And we're going to answer the second question first. Can organized religion even be a tool that serves women? The 3 Abrahamic religions all focus on the removal of the self, of the ego, which is the desires, the impulses, the flaws of the individual. And to be clear, again, this is the Abrahamic religions, not other religions, because in other religions, ego is defined completely differently. In Abrahamic religions, the self is portrayed as flawed. So our role is to follow and to submit. And that's why submission is built into the core identity of these religions. For example, the literal meaning of the word Islam is submission or surrender. In Christianity, Jesus died for our sins, and so humans are indebted to him and are inferior to him because we're all born sinners, especially in Catholicism with this concept of original sin. Eve's punishment for eating the forbidden fruit is labor pains. And that's why every single woman has to have a painful labor, because we're being punished for something that Eve did. So we've done something wrong, especially women. We've done something wrong before we've even taken our first breath. We're guilty until we're proven innocent. But we're only guilty until proven innocent after we die. And we're taught that the highest moral good is following God's will. Not your own desires or your intuitions, which can be wrong and unreliable and sinful and could make you proud. but to follow the will of God. And all religions, all the Abrahamic religions have a duality or a contrast between the righteous self and the evil self. And the goal is to overcome that ego and to have self-erasure, to remove the self, to remove the ego and the impulses and the desires and the pride that plague us. Now, that ego death is paradoxical because people who follow religion tend to be very self-centered because they think that their religious views are superior to everyone else's. Some of the most judgmental people I have known have been religious, and some of the people who've looked me in the eye and have told me some of the most disrespectful things, like how misguided or how unintelligent or how empty I am, have been religious people. They speak to me the same way that someone speaks to me when I mention I don't want to have kids, and they gaslight me about that. So it's really paradoxical because if you're supposed to remove yourself and your ego, but then you're self-centered and think that your religion is right and everybody else is wrong for not following it, and you're also being judgmental, which I thought judgment was reserved for God, it doesn't make sense. For example, I had a math teacher in high school who was very religious. She was a very outspoken Christian. One day in math class, my desk was close to hers, and so I was just sitting there working on whatever math problem I was solving, probably doing it wrong. Two girls approached her desk to hand in their assignments. I can't remember what exactly they said, but they were engaging in some kind of small talk, and then out of the blue, she asks them, "Are you Christian?" And the girls say, "No, we're Muslim." And the teacher pauses for a second and then says, "You're going to hell." And she was dead serious. She just told these two 15, 16-year-old girls that they are going to hell for not being Christian. And at the time, I was still practicing Islam and I was praying and doing all those things. And so I'm like, I got to keep my head down and just be quiet because she's going to come after me next. And I felt really weird and kind of scared of this woman. So when people say, oh, being religious makes me a better person, or you're so empty because you're not religious, well, I mean, if you need the threat of eternal punishment and the will of God to make you a good person and to make you just act like a respectful human being, then that sounds like a character flaw on your part. Now let's go back to this self-erasure, this removal of the self. This ego death, or self-erasure, whatever you want to call it, tends to affect men less badly, or not as badly, as women. Because men already see themselves reflected in the divine, because God is a man. And in the hierarchy of these religions, for example, the priests, the imams, the sheikhs, a lot of these religious officials can only be men. And they're also given the upper hand in power dynamics. For example, the relationship between the man and his wife, the father and his daughter. So men see themselves reflected in these higher categories, in these hierarchies, more than women. And religion can be something that is self-reinforcing and self-affirming for men, because even though they might, remove their ego and their impulses and their desires and feel self-righteous about that, they still have authority. They still have authority over women, and they still have authority over other people. Men only have to submit to God, but women have to submit to their fathers, their husbands, maybe their older brothers, their guardians. And so they're faced with more self-erasure. And religions tend to reward traits like humility, modesty, obedience, which are the exact traits that girls are socialized to embody. And this is what I think is that missing piece that a lot of the research does not understand. That girlhood socialization makes girls more likely to follow religion. Because when you're socialized into thinking that humility, modesty, obedience are traits that make you a better person, what better way to do that than by following a ready-made religion that rewards those traits and promises an eternity of rewards for embodying those traits? So socialization around humility and obedience grooms girls to follow religion. And then religion grooms girls for people pleasing and guilt. So it's this cycle that just continues on. And for most people, the menu of religions that you can follow contains one option. It's the one that you're born into, it's the one that your family practices. Name one other major life decision that shapes so many aspects of your life and who you are that only has one option for you, at least for your childhood and adolescence. Maybe as an adult, you decide to leave that religion or follow another one. But a lot of people also risk getting disowned or having some kind of friction with their families for doing that. So I really think that that socialization piece is the missing link that the research that I was looking at could not answer. And I was getting really frustrated reading these articles because I was like, y'all are straying further away from God's light. Because they just could not answer that question. So religion and girlhood socialization are both forms of grooming that are complementary to one another. Now, as we're going to discuss later on in this episode, religion developed mainly through a social function that it served. So that social piece is extremely important because these traits like humility, obedience, modesty are not just taught at home, but they're taught and they're enforced in school, in media. Remember my example from a few laws ago about, what was it, Law 28, Act Spoiled? I used the example of Sharpay and Gabriella in High School Musical. And even though it's a silly little movie, that's still something that girls watch at an impressionable age and they form opinions and ideas of how they need to act. So again, school, media, work, all these institutions enforce these traits in girls. It's not like you learn about it at home and you're done. And unfortunately, girls are taught to seek their value. Not just in religion, but in the way that they're socialized. They're taught to seek their value and find it externally through validation, while boys are taught to exert their value. And it's flipped. Girls have inherent worth because they are the ones who are able to create life. Everyone is born with inherent worth. Male or female, you are born with inherent worth. But somewhere along the line, girls are taught that they're not, and that they have to seek their worth and prove themselves to other people. And then a lot of girls are taught that practicing religion will make them a better person. I thought that for a while. I thought that by doing these things, I'm going to be a better person, and layer the fear on top of that, and you have this perfect recipe for obedience. Practicing a religion does not automatically make you a better person. It just makes you a more compliant and controllable person. Look at the way religious authority figures are viewed. For example, father. Again, another title that gives creation ability to a man. But a lot of religious figures are viewed as saintly, as better. They're better than us because they're more spiritually pure. They are better able to control themselves, their impulses. They're celibate. They're blah. I mean, come on, no, they're not celibate. But look at the way religious authority figures are viewed. The reverence, the holiness. It's as if truly they are morally better than us. But let me remind you that some of the worst atrocities in history were committed in the name of religion. Let me remind you that there is a genocide happening right now as we speak in the name of religion. And I shouldn't say a genocide. There are multiple atrocities happening as we speak, as you are listening to this podcast. But unfortunately, many girls and women are socialized to think that their value and what makes them a good person is something that they have to attain. And in religion, that is done through repeated practice. Because a lot of rituals are done through repeated practice. They're done repeatedly with the promise of a reward. Like praying 5 times a day, like going to church every week. And so many of women's mindsets that keep them small are rooted in religion, like suffering in silence, like being guilty. And a lot of my patriarchy hacks actually undo the damage that has been inflicted by religion. Like my hack number 1, don't be humble. Hack number 7, remove guilt from your emotions. Hack 17, act like a winner before you win. That one talks a lot about how suffering in silence is not a virtue. A lot of these traits we've been taught are virtuous stem from religion. And so I'm out here working OT to undo all this religious crap that's been inflicted on so many women. Some would say I'm doing God's work. We're going to talk about God soon, don't worry. But even my grandma, who I quoted in my book, if you got to the end of the book, you know what I'm talking about. My grandma is a perfect example of a woman who was raised in religion, has spent her whole life in religion, and thinks it makes her a better person, and also feels like she has no choice. My grandma's father was a very prominent religious figure in Shiraz, in my family's hometown. And he was even mentioned in some of the books that I read in my master's for one of my classes on dictatorships, because every class about dictatorships has to mention Iran. But he was literally mentioned in that book. He was a very prominent religious figure. And my grandma, she was the youngest daughter and the second youngest child in that family. I think she was number 5 out of 6. And she told me a couple of weeks ago, she doesn't know I'm writing this episode, but she told me that she wishes her dad were still alive so she can ask, because she has so many questions to ask him. And because she was the youngest daughter, she has a lot of inferiority built into her, into the way that she views herself. She got married off at 17 and was never able to go to university, while her brother, who's 2 years younger than her, has a PhD. It makes me so sad thinking about this, because if my grandma had the opportunity to go to university, I talk about this with my mom all the time. We think she would have been a human rights lawyer. And I'm getting sad thinking about it because, and again, this was rooted in religion, because she was brought up in a very religious household and in a very formal household where the father was the patriarch of the family and had the ultimate authority. And I see this all the time because I hang out with my grandma all the time. I see this. She still has a lot of that sense of inferiority in her life. After 80 odd years, you can't get rid of that. It's very hard to get rid of that. And it goes back to that repeated exposure, because she was treated as lesser than throughout her whole life, throughout her whole childhood and adolescence, until she was handed off from her father to her husband. And repeated exposure through religious practice, repeatedly engaging in these rituals and in these practices, actually shuts down the part of the brain that controls our sense of self, which is fascinating. I'm going to discuss that soon. But what we really need to understand at this point of the conversation is that women's religiosity starts with socialization, and then it's cemented through neural wiring in our brains. Now, I want to shift our focus a little bit. I want to look at the way religions developed, because many conversations on religion and women tend to focus on the patriarchal aspect of it, which is completely valid, like I discussed right now, but they tend to overlook the history, not just the history of Abrahamic religions, but the history of how religions developed in the human species. And it's within that history that we have some of the answers to the ultimate question of whether religion can be a tool for women. The late Dutch primatologist Frans de Waal found that religion exists in every single culture and society. So that's our first hint, because if it's this universal, then it must have some social purpose. And he defines religion as the shared reverence for the supernatural, sacred, or spiritual, as well as the symbols, rituals, and worships that are associated with it. So there are two things of importance here. The first one is that religion does not necessarily mean worshiping a god. And number two is the shared experience. Religion started as communal practices and experiences, and then after hundreds of thousands of years, it shifted to beliefs about God and morality. Okay, so while I discuss this next part, I want you to keep in mind the number 150. Robin Dunbar is an anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist who did a lot of research on how religions evolved. Or I shouldn't say evolved, I'll say developed, because evolution implies that it went from something primitive to something more developed. which is not necessarily the case in this discussion, and he's very clear about this too. So religion developed in two stages. The shamanic, this word is so weird, shamanic and the doctrinal. Shamanic religions date back to hunter-gatherers, and we can trace them back up to around 250,000 years. And in the early stages of these religions, there were no gods, no moral codes. It was really focused on a spirit world that you would enter by doing trance dances and other types of rituals that were very physically demanding. Like, they were so demanding and so exhausting that all you could focus on is the activity that you're engaging in. It's like when I go to the gym and I go really, really hard on my accessory work and I'm like blacking out, like all I can think about is how much pain I'm in. It's basically the same experience. And these rituals were done in groups, and they resulted in a huge release of endorphins, which are hormones that are basically natural painkillers that elevate your mood, and they're released during things like exercise and orgasm. So these feel-good hormones are being released while you're in this trance state. And what happens is an intense social bonding takes place through this collective release of endorphins and dopamine. Now, as these religions developed in later phases, we see shamans and healers. And it bears mentioning here that female shamans were the norm. So these religions were more so focused on communal bonding and entering these spiritual trances that happened through rituals like trance dancing. Remember when I said to keep in mind 150? That's the size of these communities. There were around 100 to 200 people. It was a pretty small scale activity, and the social bonding element was the most important part. It was literally a group of people just getting high as fuck together, and the shaman like holding the blunt and telling a story, and people being like, girl, pass the blunt, pass the blunt. That's pretty much what it was. It was just a group of people bonding in their communities. Now, the number 150 is also significant because the anthropologist Robin Dunbar says that that's the number of the natural size of a human group. That's pretty much as large as a group can be while still having social order and being able to keep track of its members. And that was also the typical size of hunter-gatherer communities where humans spent 95% of our existence. So that was the first stage of religion. Now, around the time of, come on, y'all know the drill, the Neolithic Revolution, which is when agriculture and permanent settlements became a thing, around 10 to 12,000 years ago, that's when we begin to see a major shift in religion, especially in the rise of doctrinal religions. The Neolithic Revolution began in what's called the Fertile Crescent, or the Cradle of Civilization, which is a crescent-shaped area in the Middle East, which encompasses modern-day Iraq, Jordan, this made-up country called Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, parts of northern Kuwait, southeastern Turkey, and western Iran. Shout out to Iran. So that's where the rise of agriculture happened, and that's also where we've been able to trace back the first ritual spaces. The oldest one is found in Turkey. So around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, when humans became city girls and the population of a community went from around 150 to tens of thousands, usually around 30 to 60,000 people, that's when we see this big shift in religion. That's when religion entered its doctrinal phase. Because now that humans are in these large permanent settlements that have a lot of social complexity and a lot of social issues that arise when that many people are in one space permanently together, the need for social cohesion rises. Now, y'all know what happens when a group of large people get together. They build a hierarchy and they gotta flex on each other and decide who better than who. And so you got the new money Athenians wearing their togas and holding them up with their new Versace belts, and people just flexing on each other, and this whole social stratification that happens. And religion was quick to adapt to that need for managing these social relations, having cohesion, and having this hierarchy. It rose to the challenge by having rituals, and having moralizing high gods that are the moral police that reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. And the Abrahamic religions grew out of this moralizing high god lineage. And they took the development of religion to its final stage and allowed them to scale to the point where they can have millions of followers. Throw back to the number of 150. That number has been squashed. It's done now. Now we're at the final boss, the final form of religion, which is the doctrinal phase. And this is where we see formal theology. We see written texts. We see these institutions being built around the religion. We see the moralizing high God. And we see priests. And around that time is also when we see the emergence of kings. Kings and God emerged around the same time, around 5,000 years ago or 3000 BCE. So religion went from something that was practice-based in a small community to something that is belief-based, with hierarchies, written moral codes, institutions, bureaucracies, and standardized and repeated rituals, and most importantly, a god, specifically a male god. So religion didn't start as a patriarchal institution. In fact, it was quite the opposite. But it devolved into one. Now, remember how I said earlier how engaging in repeated religious rituals shuts down areas of our brain? Let's look at that now. So the social aspect of religion helped us focus on that macro level of how religion served communities and served social bonding. Because for pretty much all of history, religion has been a shared social experience. Now let's look at the micro level and understand what's happening to the individual, what's happening in our brains when we engage in religion. The American neuroscientist Andrew Newberg has studied how the brain responds to religion and to different spiritual experiences, and his findings are really interesting. He found that religious experiences satisfy two functions of the brain. The first one is self-maintenance, which is how we survive as individuals and as species. And the second one is self-transcendence, which is how we continue to evolve and change ourselves as people. And he found that during religious experiences and rituals, two areas of the brain shuts down. One of them is the parietal lobe, which is the area of the brain that processes sensory information and helps us create our sense of self. Over time, as an individual practices a religious ritual, the parietal lobe shuts down and that person's sense of self starts to blur, and the boundary between the self and the other starts to break down. And that's how people get this very deep conviction and belief in God. The second area of the brain that shuts down is the frontal lobe, which is the area of the brain that manages thinking, emotions, personality, judgment, self-control, memory storage. The frontal lobe is responsible for a lot of functions, and it's the area of the brain that doesn't finish developing until age 25 in women and until around postmortem in men. The frontal lobe usually helps us focus our attention and concentrate on things. But during religious experiences, the frontal lobe shuts down and it makes us feel like something is happening to us rather than us making something happen out in the world. Think back to the tribal dancing and how people engaging in that could feel like they were entering a trance, entering the spirit world. They felt possessed, not just because of the endorphins and the dopamine that was being released in their brains, but also probably because these two areas of their brains were being shut down. Now, something that's also really interesting is that the neuroscience research has found that there are certain cognitive and evolutionary functions that predispose humans to religious belief, especially in contexts of finding agency and intention with things that we can't easily explain. For example, neuroscientists theorize that there's this thing in our brain called the hypersensitive agency detection device, or HAD for short, which they theorize is this cognitive function that causes us to attribute agency to noises and objects. For example, if you hear a rustling sound in the bushes, you might think it's a predator. You attributed agency to that sound. It could very well be the wind, but You attribute that agency, and it serves an evolutionary purpose that tells you, get away from that bush. And it bears mentioning that there's no link to gender, and these are theorized cognitive functions. Scientists haven't actually been able to prove this, but based on the research, this is what they've been able to theorize. Have you ever engaged in existential thinking and felt really scared and overwhelmed? That's not an experience that's unique to you. It scares a lot of people. And religion helps to alleviate that burden because it makes sense of the world that came before you, the world that you live in now, and the world that's going to come after you through a ready-made doctrine. It makes sense of complex things by giving them a simple answer, which is God. And I remember growing up, when I would ask questions about religion, a lot of the time I'd be shut down. I was told that it's haram, that I shouldn't be asking these questions. And as a naturally inquisitive person, that didn't sit well with me because a lot of things didn't make sense to me. And the more questions I asked and the more dead ends I got to, the more unsettled I felt. Because why can't I ask questions? Why is it not allowed to ask questions and understand things fully and come to understand these things on my own terms? And listen, back in the day, back in 3000 BCE, when life was hard and it was full of suffering and the average lifespan was like 12 minutes, religion was probably a very useful thing for most people because it promised a reward for the suffering that they were enduring in their lifetime. Oh, my life is terrible now and I have syphilis and gangrene and everything sucks, but you know what? After I die, I'm going to have a really rewarding afterlife. And I'm sure that was a very comforting thought for a lot of people whose lives were completely ass. You might be thinking at this point, okay, religion was made by men for men. Yet, as we saw with the neuroscience research and also the anthropological and sociological research, it's very clear that humans have a need to make sense of the world, and they have a tendency to develop spirituality as a response to that. But what does that all mean for women? Do we just ditch organized religion and call it a day? We'll be back after the break to put that question to rest. Let's see who's paying my bills this week and just fast forward through those ads so we can get the show on the road. Can religion serve women? As women, we already have everything we need within ourselves. And patriarchal religions are a distraction from that. That removal of self, of the ego, makes us oblivious to our own power because it's distracting us from who we are. It's distracting us from turning inwards and trusting our intuition, trusting our desires, trusting ourselves. We already have everything we need within ourselves. It's analogous to a female being born with all her eggs. And I don't believe God is a woman. I believe woman is God. Women are the creators. And what religion has done, it's given men credit for that. And it's found a way to shame us for the physical evidence of us being creators. Because sure, you can create a narrative about how God is a man and how women came from the rib of a man, but the receipts are still there. The physical evidence is still there. Women are still the ones who give birth. Women are still the ones who breastfeed. Women are still the ones who menstruate. And because they can't take that away from us, they've developed narratives to shame us for it. And what women need isn't more ego death and removal of self. Women need ego revival. We need more encouragement to look inward, to trust our intuition, and to trust our bodies, to become more in sync with our cycles and to understand, okay, at this point of the month, I'm more creative. At this point of the month, I need to do X. I track my period with my strength training, so I know exactly when I can be doing heavy lifts and when I should be taking a deload, for example, so that everything is synchronized and working in harmony with each other. There are certain points in the month where I can't write an episode because I'm just not that creative. I'm feeling really down and depressed. And so I save those periods of creativity for the times in my cycle when I actually have more creative juices flowing in my brain. So we as women need to look inwards more, not outwards. And especially not to men and male religious figures and authority figures to help us with our spiritual needs. what makes me really happy is that a lot of women are waking up to this. A lot of women are understanding that religion is not a spiritual tool made for women. So to answer my question, no, religion can't serve women. Patriarchal religion specifically cannot serve women. And what we're seeing right now, especially in the West, is a shift away from religion and a shift towards spirituality. But not the spirituality that we saw, that I discussed earlier, the shamanistic spirituality where it's community-based, but a more individualistic spirituality. Because religion is a one-size-fits-all. It's a one male size fits all. It's like getting a male t-shirt. It's not going to look flattering on you, it's not going to fit you well, and it's not going to serve your purposes. You're going to look like you're wearing a potato sack. And religion is not how you give meaning to the world. It's how somebody else does, and how they coerce you into believing that by using the threat of hell and punishment. And that's extremely problematic because no two people experience the world in the same way. So religion can't work. You cannot be operating your life and having your beliefs and your worldviews be dictated by somebody else, especially by men who lived thousands of years ago who are finished decomposing. So what I believe women need to do is, again, look internally, understand, really strip away that shame that we've been taught, that many of us in religion have been taught about our bodies and about its abilities to create. Be more in tune with that and also experience that ego revival. And I think we need to engage more with women and have a community, but of women, so that we can both introspect individually and also come together and still have that social bonding, because religion came out of the social bonding element that tribal dancing and these rituals provided. So it's a highly social experience. And even today, people are very active in their religious communities. A lot of people stay in their religions because they have a community within it. So we need to be true to ourselves, but we also need to seek the community that this shared experience can provide. I just don't think that organized religion is the answer. Because when we strip away all that doctrinal and patriarchal crap, frankly, I'm going to call it crap, we're left with spirituality. We're left with the spirituality that so many people need, especially in the butt-crack world that we live in today. Humans have a tendency to want to make sense of the world and to want to understand why we're here and how can I give meaning to my life and how can I understand what it means to be here. We have that tendency, but religion is not the tool that we need. It's spirituality. And not everyone is spiritual. People have different spiritual inclinations. Some people might not be spiritual at all. Some people might be highly spiritual. Some people might meditate. Some people might do yoga. Whatever it is, it's on your own terms. It's your choice. No one is using fear and punishment to force you into it, because it's how you make sense of the world, not how somebody else does and has shoved it down your throat. So to wrap up this episode, and I know this is a long one, those two questions that I posed at the beginning. If religions are patriarchal, why do women tend to be more religious than men? I think that the answer, in large part, is in the way girls are socialized, because girlhood socialization incentivizes obedience, modesty, humility, which then fit within the mold of this ready-made religion that rewards those traits and tells you that you're a good person if you follow this religion and you exhibit those traits. And following religion then in turn grooms girls for people-pleasing and guilt and serving other people and seeking their value by what they can do for others, which then reinforces that cycle. Not to say that the psychological, social, cultural, even genetic, and all other factors don't play into this. I think it's a variety of these factors. But the biggest one, in my opinion, is the socialization. And as we saw with religion developing out of a social need, I think that tells us how important that social element of religion is. So that's the answer to the first question. The second question, like I just discussed, whether religion can be a tool that serves women, I don't think so. I think when we strip away all the doctrines and all the patriarchy and all the misogyny and the shame, guilt, fear, and all these other things, we're left with what most people crave. which is spirituality, which is just some form of making sense of the world. And women can make so much sense of the world by looking inward and being more in tune with themselves, with their intuition, with their cycle, with just what makes them who they are. Because women have everything they need already within themselves. So I think it's about embracing that and also building communities with fellow women. All right, baddies, I'm going to end this episode here. This was a long one. It was definitely not an easy one to write or to record, but it is definitely in my top 3 favorites, and I hope it is for you as well. If you're in the process of unlearning a lot of the religious mindsets that have been indoctrinated in you, previous episodes of my podcast will help. My patriarchy hacks and my book will really, really help with that. Actually, I forgot to mention this. Someone actually DM'd me the other day saying that my book has been helping her unlearn a lot of the religious trauma that she's endured as a recovering Christian. So I thought that was amazing and very timely for this episode. And I'm not just saying this. I genuinely want to help women. I really like experiencing this myself and also seeing it in women around me. I want to help women recover from a lot of the crap that they've been taught. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book and even started this podcast to begin with. So if you have a friend who's recovering from religion, send this to her. Or, if you have a religious friend, send this to her too. All right, thank you all so much for tuning in. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I know you all had a lot to say when I had that prompt up on my story about your religious experiences. So I want to keep the conversation going and hear what some of the other baddies have to say who didn't share. So I really want to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to rate this podcast 5 stars if you love it. And if you hate it, then I don't know how you got to the end of this episode. Thank you all so much for your support. And don't forget that you are the baddest bitch in any building that you step foot in. All right, until next time, stay bad. Love you. Bye. Shout out to Kate, Danny, Adriana, Mina, Gemma, Priya, Katya, May, Naomi, Nilufar, Adelaide, Nadia, Faith, Amy, Simran, Melinda, Bindi, Sophia M, Sophia K, Jada, Yael, Roselle, Amara, Kat, Jin, Delia, May, and Viv. Thank you all so much for your support. Now, speaking of books, let's get into today's reading. So I'm going to share something from the Bible, from Genesis 3:16. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. This sounds this is giving some subservience and obedience to the husband. But a lot of the time people say that the context matters and we need to read the whole verse. So let's read the whole verse. I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Well, that's the whole thing, and that's the context. So basically, Eve cursed all women with labor pains because she ate the forbidden fruit. This sounds a lot like the shame and punishment that's tied to the physical evidence of women being the creators. But okay, that's just one verse. Let's look at another one. This is from Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife because he has violated her. Okay, so the woman is the property, and if a man rapes a virgin, then he has to pay her father and marry her. Okay, but that's just 2 verses. Let's look at another one. We need context, right? If a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of the foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch any hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary, until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days. Okay, so if a woman gives birth, she's unclean. If she gives birth to a son, she's quite unclean. But if she gives birth to a daughter, she's horrendously unclean. Okay, that was just 3 verses. Let's see another one. Okay, so this one is from Leviticus 15:19, and then we'll skip down to 29 and 30. When a woman has a discharge of blood, which is her regular discharge from her body, she shall be in her impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. It's a long time. And on the 8th day, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest, to the door of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall offer one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for her unclean discharge. So menstruation is an infirmity, and it is dirty, and it requires a sin offering. Okay, that is enough reading.